Welcome to the second episode of Netting Zero, a virtual event series on climate from the New York Times. This episode is brought to you by Con Edison. At Con Edison, we believe sustainable changes can make a substantial impact in our communities. That's why we're committed to making clean energy more accessible and affordable for more New Yorkers. From investing in renewable generation to expanding our energy efficiency programs, we're powering progress today to make way for a cleaner New York tomorrow. Learn more about our commitment to clean energy at coned.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of Netting Zero, our virtual event series presented by the New York Times on climate change. My name is Whitney Richardson, and I am the Global Events Manager for the New York Times. Thank you all for joining us from around the world. Our goal of the Netting Zero series is to bring solution-driven ideas to the forefront and to create the conditions for a more informed conversation on climate action. And as we've seen with the most recent climate news coming from California to Oregon, these conversations could not be more timely and more urgent. We kicked off this series back in July, where a dynamic list of speakers discussed how we can apply the hard-earned lessons from COVID-19 to scaling climate action. This series will continue as we approach COP26 in November 2021, and the New York Times' Climate Hub, an open multi-use space that will host in Glasgow. It will be a destination for innovators, students, community members, business leaders, policymakers, and others to discuss and debate scalable climate solutions. Today's conversation between our dynamic speakers will be moderated by Brad Plumer, climate reporter for the New York Times. Before we begin, just a few logistical notes. Audience members, you can submit your questions through the chat function, and we encourage you to do so. You can also follow our conversations on social media with the hashtag #NettingZero. We would also like to thank our sponsor for today's session, Con Edison. With that, I will hand over to my colleague, Brad, to begin today's discussion. Hello, Brad.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining us. So in this discussion series, we're going to look at what it takes to get to net zero emissions globally. And cities are really a great place to focus on. Cities are where nearly 60% of the world's people live today. So if we're thinking about how humanity is going to become carbon neutral, and this conference is, after all, netting zero, we're going to need to radically rethink our cities. That means rethinking how we get around, how we heat and cool our buildings, what we do with our trash, where we get our electricity. And already we've seen plenty of cities around the world experiment with different ways of reducing emissions. Paris has taken dramatic steps since 1990 to shift commuting patterns away from cars and toward transit, walking and biking. New York City recently passed a sweeping law requiring large skyscrapers to become more energy efficient. Cities like Oslo are setting goals to become completely carbon neutral in the decades ahead, which means everything from replacing wood stoves in homes to electrifying cars and local ships. The big challenge here, though, is that these efforts really need to scale up very, very rapidly if the world wants to become carbon neutral by mid-century. And every city is different. Every city has its own history, geography, climate, other nuances. What works in Copenhagen may not work in Cairo or New Delhi. So we've seen organizations like C40 spring up so that urban planners and city officials can learn from each other and share what they've learned about cutting emissions. But there's no question it's a huge challenge, and there's a lot more that needs to be done if cities want to tackle climate change. So today we're going to hear about some of the efforts going on around the world as cities try to rapidly reduce their emissions. We're going to ask questions like, what are some of the lessons they've learned so far? What are the obstacles they're facing? What does it take to bring about systematic change in a city? And as part of its Netting Zero virtual series, the New York Times is bringing together a diverse group to answer that question. We've got mayors, an urban designer, experts in technology, in the built environment, in public health, in the history of science. And that's really a testament to the fact that solutions for cities will really need to come from all quarters. So we're joined today, I'm pleased to say, by Chile's high-level champion for climate action, Gonzalo Muñoz. For each event in the New York Times Netting Zero series, we're going to have a climate champion who will set the stage with a challenge for today's participants and frame the discussion with a series of points to consider. And with that, welcome, Gonzalo. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Brad. And definitely thank you to the New York Times for this fantastic initiative. In general, Netting Zero, understanding the challenges that we're facing, leading the change. And in this particular case of this session, the new zero carbon normal for cities is so timely because we are living in this hopefully new normality, so related not only to the climate crisis, but also to the COVID-19 crisis. And we have seen how COVID-19 pandemic has shown cities two possible paths due to the panic it naturally generates, right? One possibility in which citizens escape from downtown areas and colonize new low-density suburbs where they do not expect to coincide with others in crowded public spaces or public transport. And then another one where cities are carefully planned in reasonably dense neighborhoods where citizens can reach jobs, education, commerce, and leisure opportunities within reasonable traveling distances. This dream or utopia of a 15-minute city has been properly stated by Anne Hidalgo, mayor of Paris. We have seen an expression of this last option also with people now doing home office, deciding to move to smaller cities that can offer this 15-minute quality of life. How do you feel about these two paths? That's the type of challenge that I want to present to our following panelists. Which opportunities, threats, challenges, paths do you foresee, not only for developed, but also for developing city? Because North and South have different challenges, right? How do those different types of city are foreseen in the path you would recommend? Let's consider not just the COVID crisis, but of course also forthcoming crises that may be waiting them right around the corner.
Thanks so much, Gonzalo. So I'd like to briefly introduce the three speakers from our first panel today. We have Mayor Claudia López Hernández, the mayor of Bogota, Colombia. We have Mayor Iván Aki-Sawyer, the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone. And then we have Laurent Bataille, Executive Vice President of Schneider Electric. We're going to start with some opening statements from the panelists and then dive into questions and discussions. And we invite readers to send in questions that I can then read and ask here on our virtual stage. Mayor Aki-Sawyer, let's start with you. Freetown has a number of initiatives to reduce climate emissions, including both planting trees and tackling emissions from waste. Could you tell us a bit about those efforts and what makes Freetown unique, why its climate challenge is different from what other cities may be thinking about, what Paris or New York may be thinking about?
Thanks so much, Brad, and it's great to be here. Like you said, there are going to be differences by virtue of where we are economically, but also in terms of the demographics, population. But from Freetown's perspective, this question of getting to zero is both about reducing emissions, where in our case, the main emissions are from transport and poor sanitation, as well as creating a carbon sink. So let me start with the carbon sink. We launched earlier this year, Freetown the Tree Town, a plan to plant 1 million trees in a year. And we're well on our way. 500,000 are going into the ground between now and the end of October. But this isn't just about planting trees, it's about growing trees. It's about having community engagement as that happens. This is a key feature, we believe, in sustainable climate action, making sure the communities are alongside with us. So here we have tree stewards who are ordinary Freetonians, but where the difference comes in is we have a tracker, an app that's enabling us to monitor the growth of the trees. So that's what we're doing in terms of offsetting carbon emissions. That process also creates green jobs, as does another area, and that area is waste management. Here, we're moving away from our methane-emitting dump sites to sanitary landfills. And depending on where you are in the world, you might feel like a landfill is old hat. That's a thing of the past. But for some countries, such as my own, where you're moving from dump sites, which were very, very damaging to the environment, moving on to a sanitary landfill is actually a step, very much a step in the right direction. And we're doing so in a manner which creates organic jobs, green jobs among young people. Transport can't be overlooked. And this, again, as I said, is our second biggest emitter. Carbon coming from old vehicles, low occupancy vehicles, which we're looking to replace, not completely, of course, but to introduce for the first time mass transit, inspired by cities in Latin America. We're working on a cable car, a green cable car system. And as we pull all of this together, we have, with the support of C40s, as part of the C40 family, we're now working on a climate action plan that will give us tangible goals to getting to zero. Can't do this on our own. Many cities know that one of our challenges often is how we interact with the central governments, with national governments. We're committed to doing so, and we look forward to a green-free town.
Thanks so much. And Mayor Lopez, so Bogota, as I understand, is trying to create right now these 30-minute neighborhoods within cities where residents can basically meet many of their shopping and work and recreational needs within a 30-minute walk or bike ride or transit ride. Can you tell us a bit about what this actually looks like on the ground and whether there are other cities Bogota is either trying to learn from or can learn from with what the city has done so far?
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to share with you some ideas of what's happening in Bogota currently. We have a great opportunity this year is that we can define with the City Council our land use planning for the next 15 years. And what we're trying to do is to change the form the city is developed and planned from the 2-hour city, that has a big center in which everybody comes every day to work, and then they live in the periphery of the city. This makes, for a 2-hour city, with long distances, high pollution, and a waste of time and opportunities for people who has to spend almost 30% of their income in transportation, which is, very unequal and unfair for poor families, is not really sustainable because it's, using basically not green transportation, but better polluted forms of transportation. So we're trying to change that for green corridors and green districts to organize and plan our city, not exactly for the 15-minute city as Paris is trying to do, because to change from 2-hour city to 15-minute city is like a big, big change, but at least to a 30-minute districts in which we can use sustainable forms of transportation. We're just doing and building our first metro line. We're trying to do a regional system of metro, which is, of course, electric and sustainable, not only for the city, but also for the suburbs, because otherwise people will live, farther and farther away using non-clean forms of transportation. So we want to use or to include the metro regional system, the cycloway system, which is a great advantage of Bogota. Bogota is probably the city around the developing world who has the highest and longest network for bikes in the world. We have more than 600 kilometers, around 600 kilometers right now. And we're gonna add close to 250 new kilometers of cycloways around the city. So making the city 30-minute districts, which are developed for pedestrians. Is not a city to pass away, it's a city to stay, to enjoy in 30 minutes distance with sustainable transportation and especially good infrastructure for pedestrians and for bikes. That's sort of the city that we're trying to build. And the great opportunity is not only that we have, in public investment to do it, along with the national government, but we can plan this city for the next 15 years in our land use planning that we're approving with the city council this year. Now, the biggest threat, I will say, to this plan is precisely the economic crisis due to the pandemic. Because of course, this is reducing, unfortunately, fiscal income for both the local and the national government. So we're trying to manage this situation in which we don't want to go to the back normality, which is very polluted, high congestion of traffic and so on and so forth, very unsustainable in terms of the environment. But we want to keep our targets for reducing air pollution, improving the city and the development of mobility, especially sustainable mobility in the city, and developing these 30-minute districts, following, of course, the inspiration of Paris plans, which, by the way, are assessed by a Colombian architect right there in Paris. We've been in contact with him, with Carlos Moreno. So we're inspired by different cities, but also we're trying to develop our own landmark in sustainable development to achieve also the sustainable development goals by 2030.
Right. It's if I can ask before getting to Laurent, both of the mayors, often we hear that a huge solution for transportation emissions is shifting very rapidly to electric vehicles. It sounds like both of your cities are really focused on rethinking how we get around. And I was wondering if you could comment a bit, are electric vehicles, is that part of it? Is it not quite appropriate for your cities? Is it not something that cities themselves can have the levers to really move? Or is there a sense that, you know, just trying to address this with new car technology isn't going to be enough to confront all the different climate challenges cities face?
I think the more important thing is not, of course, it's much better to have electric mobility rather than, you know, diesel or gas mobility, of course. But I think the key, at least in developing cities, very dense, great cities such as Bogota, 8 million people, within a metropolitan region of 10 million people, is not only the way we move, is how long or short we move. If we can organize the city in 30 minutes districts, you know, it's easy to walk, to bike, to use public transportation around a 30-minute city. But if you have 2 hours on average distance, then you're forced to use modes of transportation that end up being polluted. So I think the key factor is to build and plan the city so that you have different centralities around the city that are walkable, bikeable in a 30 minutes distance, rather than in 2 hours distance from the periphery to the center, also because there is only work in the center, there is only education opportunities in the center, and all the big and poor periphery gets around. It's overcoming the distances, the inequality, the segregation of the city that will lead us to have a more sustainable city. That's our view, and that's what we're trying to do. Of course, to connect the different districts through green corridors. If you ask me, the most important investment in the 21st century is not even metros. We are very, you know, far away in building our metro system. We need to keep doing that in these years. But the most important thing is the pedestrian and the bike network. If we really build a network in which is safe, you prevent, it's not only safe in terms of you know, security, that you're safer from being attacked or things like that, but it's safer in the sense that you have good infrastructure to move around, to get services, to share different services. So in my opinion, of course, we're putting all the incentives we can so that people use clean public transportation or clean private transport modes. But the key factor is to reduce this segregated center periphery city, which is 2 hours away from everything, rather than to have, instead of that, 30 minutes districts, green and green corridors.
So we've been talking a lot about transportation, and Laurent, I'd love to talk about some of your work at Schneider Electric, where you work on reducing emissions from buildings, which are the other huge source of carbon dioxide in many cities from heating and cooling. Can you paint a picture for us of what the low carbon buildings of the future might actually look like?
Yeah, certainly, Brad. I would say that the first thing that I find very interesting in the conversation so far is we are talking about a lot about transportation, which is a huge source of carbon emissions indeed, and probably a problem for the well-being of people in cities. And it goes a bit together, you know, how you tackle sustainability and well-being. Now, when we turn to buildings, they're actually another very big part of the carbon emissions. We actually estimate that between building construction and operations in cities, they generate close to 40% of the CO2 emissions in the world, which is really, really big. So tackling the building and the built environment is very important for a sustainability perspective. But also, if you think about it, we spend 80 to 90% of our time indoors. So the reality is, as you tackle and you transform the built environment, you also can transform the experience of people and their well-being. So again, sustainability and well-being can come together in the future. Now, we're very optimistic that we today have technologies that can really help move towards much more sustainability. When we have a look at the situation of the past 50 years and the built environment, 80% of buildings today are highly inefficient. And it comes from the IEA statistics. But we now think that there's a bundle of technologies from modern electrification to the use of digital capabilities that can really help us drive hyper efficiency in the building market, both from an active energy management, of course, so a number of ways to save energy, but also again, electrification, moving away from the age of fire where we were burning things to heat or generate electricity to get some air conditioning. So really, again, electrification, but then digital with artificial intelligence, cloud technology that can help you drive the existing infrastructure in a much better manner and really go capture an additional layer of energy savings. So today the technology exists. What is not so clear is the level of awareness of the gains that are possible and really the speed at which this technology gets deployed. So for us, that's really the challenge, which is how do you make sure we deploy these technologies at mass scale, because the clock is ticking. And so really for us, and that's probably part of the conversation with cities, is how do we ensure that the various players have shared incentives to work together? Because today there's a lot of focus on the construction cost in the building industry, which is only 20% of the cost of a lifetime in a building. But unfortunately, if you're too focused on the CapEx, you may actually not choose the right technology to have a good life cycle efficiency of the building. So we really need to find ways to make sure we tear down the barriers across the various players in the value chain to deliver much better buildings for our cities.
So we're getting a whole bunch of great audience questions. And one of the thoughtful ones I thought, and Mayor Akisora, I'd love to talk to you about this a bit, is how do you create buy-in from people about these climate initiatives, especially if they have, you know, you mentioned they have a lot of benefits, but they can also have costs. They can involve change. People are not always super fond of change, especially when they're just trying to go about their daily lives, you know, get jobs, do things day to day. I mean, how do you get buy-in from the public for pursuing some of these climate initiatives?
Thanks, Brad. I think one of the things that I wanted to just lay on the table in response to your earlier question about the green transport or the electric, specifically electric, and then part of what Laurent has just said about, you know, sort of the digitization and the improved life cycle. One of the things that's really important as we talk about climate globally is recognizing how different the situation is in different parts of the world. and consequently, how differently we need to direct where that conversation goes. So in a situation like Freetown, we're not talking about electric cars because the infrastructure that's required to be able to have the charging stations, in fact, even the roads, the work that would need to be done. So I think it's really, really important in this New York Climate Week, as we're talking about the race to zero, let's be sure that we're differentiating, but that we're also ensuring that we find the common themes. Now, one common theme really is people. You know, how do you get citizen engagement? And part of what we found has been tying the consequences, and we're in a, I don't think it's a fortunate position, but Freetown is already experiencing the impact of climate change, where that climate change isn't being driven from our city. So for 5 years prior to 2018, we had terrible floods. We have abnormal rainfall. We have a real push. The mayor of Bogota has been talking about land use planning. That's something we're tackling as well this year. But we're tackling it in the context of a significant increase in our population size as a city, as people are migrating from rural areas to the city because of climate. So I guess what I'm saying here is that there's so much unpacking to do when you talk about climate. There are no simple answers, but one of the most important things to do is to ensure that you are tailoring it to your specific situation. So in Freetown, our specific situation is that we were beginning to make the link with people between terrible floods, leading to loss of life, loss of property, and climate. Making that connection, so, and then also making the connection with sanitation, making the connection with tree planting. And as I described the way Freetown, the tree town is being done, not having the government come and plant trees, the city officials come and plant trees, but go house to house, engage people, and have individual residents become tree stewards. So they commit to the trees. And it's partly because we have no space, because the city is so overpopulated that we've had to plant in people's backyards, in office parks, in school compounds. And where we have planted in open space, it's actually been outside of the city because we have so little space. But that itself has given us a hook. So I would say, how do you get people involved? You have to make it real. I was this morning speaking to a group of young people, climate activists, who are doing some innovation work. You make it personal to them. And for each of us, no matter where we are in the world, whether it's California or South Sudan, climate is becoming a personal issue because it really is touching our lives.
Yeah. Mayor Lopez, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Obviously, reshaping an entire city is a huge effort. It involves a lot of changes for a lot of people. And this connects to some of the questions we're getting from the audience. How do you get that buy-in? How do you move jobs to where people are so that they work with these 30-minute cities? And then another question that's very related to this is whether the current COVID-19 pandemic does that make these changes harder, or is it a bit of an opportunity because quicker and more systematic change is more readily possible than would be in normal times?
Well, COVID-19 is also, is a challenge for everything, and it's affecting, fiscal income. But also, I think it has led to a reflection of what our habits of life and movement and relationship can be in this century. And I think in that sense, it brings a great opportunity for change, for sustainable change. It's like nature telling us, hey, you either change or change, and now, this is urgent. So I think overall is an opportunity rather than a threat. How to move people, how to organize the city, First of all, this is not going to happen from one year to the next. That's why the land use planning for 15-year planning is an important period and a reasonable period to achieve that change. Second, you have to combine different tools. We have, for example, as a city, the opportunity to use fiscal incentives for location, for developing of combined neighborhoods with different uses. We not this old industrial city in which you either have, work in one place and neighborhoods to live in another place. Mixed uses. This is Jane Jacobs recovered, sort of in the 21st century. Like mixed uses, fiscal incentives for mixed uses, for popular housing, for people of different incomes, right? Building bikes. I can tell you in my city, in the main roads, imagine, Broadway, or Park Avenue. It's not in marginal roads in which you build infrastructure for pedestrian and bikes. We cannot be afraid of taking away lanes for congestion cars and giving them a space for pedestrians and for bike users. During the pandemic, we decided to take away 80 kilometers for cars and give them for bikes. That's the sort of decisions that you have to make if you want to build a more reliable, green, sustainable city. Because if we keep building roads for cars, and I can agree more with my dear mayor, we cannot build roads for cars, even if they are electric. Come on, 85% of the space of Bogota is devoted for cars. And cars are only 15% of the travel every day. So it doesn't make sense. If 30% of the travels per day are walkable and other 15%, 10 to 15% of travels per day are by bike, at least they should have 45% of the space rather than 15%. Of course, public transportation and fiscal incentives, mixed uses, incentives for new industries, not the old industries of the 20th century, but the new industries, the digital industries, the green businesses, the orange businesses, as somebody calls it. Those are the kind of mixtures of fiscal, land use, public investments in different modes of sustainable transportation. I think all these tools combined during at least a 15 years period is what actually could change the pattern of organization and movement in our cities to make them more sustainable, more equitable for people. Otherwise, we all only can keep, sort of opening more the gaps between people, the economic gaps, the social gaps. If we want to close those gaps, we need to develop these sort of plans as the green corridors, the green districts, and this 30-minute walkable mixed use city.
Right. Laurent, a question for you. Mayor Lopez talked about sort of 15-year land use planning. I mean, buildings, they last for longer than 15 years. They can last 100 years. So I'm curious about the pace, and there are a couple of questions along this line. Making buildings vastly more efficient, adopting these new technologies, is it just a question of waiting for the building stock to turn over and new buildings coming in, or are there things that can be done to retrofit existing buildings? And is this something cities themselves have the power to change, or is it often a question that's at other levels of government and it's not something cities can do on their own? I mean, what are some of the things that cities have been able to do to really make their housing more efficient?
Lots of very fair questions. And I've seen questions about, it's good to move to electrification, but if the electricity itself is not generated the right way, you're still going to generate a lot of carbon. So what's the ability of cities to influence that? So to answer your question on the stock, no, we cannot wait for the natural renewal. You take Europe, for instance, what we call deep renovations represent 0.2% of the building stock per year, 0.2%. Then you have a look at new construction, it might be close to 2% of the existing stock. So at this speed, you're not gonna basically move fast enough to have any impact on the climate. That's where you see more and more new regulation coming to actually create an incentive or a mandate for building owners to actually retrofit their buildings at much a more rapid pace, if you want. For instance, in Europe, that would be the EPBD regulation, that is actually gonna progressively turn into national laws. So that's one thing. You cannot wait. You need to create more incentive so that people go much faster. I would say, you know, historically retrofits were very heavy. You were thinking about having to move a lot of walls, retrofit big systems. More and more, it's gonna be software based. So you can have some light retrofit just to make your systems more intelligent, which are not so heavy to deploy. Coming to the role of cities on the mix, you know, it's not rare at all to see cities sitting down with their local utilities and having a negotiation on the generation mix. We see that, for instance, in my city here in the US, where there's been a negotiation and you have a package of renewable energy that as a city inhabitant, you can elicit to subscribe to for almost the same cost as the normal electricity you had in the past. So I think it's a matter of negotiation power. Of course, here big cities with many inhabitants and a lot of economic clout have more ability to show the way. And that's what we see, for instance, with New York City here in the US. I would say another way the cities can actually move the needle is by applying the codes. Yes, it is true that the codes are typically nationally mandated, but interestingly enough, they are not always respected or implemented. And a lot of the implementation is actually carried out locally. On top of that, some cities, again, big ones particularly, are able to develop some local codes that go above and beyond the national mandates to force building owners to actually really raise the bar in terms of energy efficiency. So you see there's a full palette from, you know, negotiation with utilities, impacting the generation mix, more efficient retrofits, playing with the code. And we're gonna have to use all of that because today we are certainly not on the right path. The speed at which we are transforming the built environment is insufficient to really cater to these 40% of CO2 emissions that are happening in buildings.
Right. One question here that I think follows that quite nicely is about the pace, and it's, you know, we see lots of cities in the U.S. Have goals of reducing carbon emissions. It sounds very much like Bogota and Freetown and many other cities are setting these ambitious goals. How can residents of these cities sort of keep officials accountable and see that institutions are moving on the right track and see that they're on pace to meet these goals? Because as we all know, you know, it's one thing to announce we're going to do all these great things, but obviously the follow through is so important. And how are people able to see that you know, these goals for reducing emissions and reducing climate impact are actually being achieved? We're have a few minutes left, so I'll ask both mayors, and we're going to have to keep it pretty quick, unfortunately.
Perhaps I'll start. So in terms of even our climate goals, our climate plan, we're in the process of developing it, and we won't be finished until next year. And this comes again to my point about everyone being in different places. Actually, even getting the data is quite a challenge, but we're working on it so that we have it. You need the data in order for you to set the target. But once the target is set, it's something that we're committed to, and it's something that we're going to project and have, you know, transparently, you know, monitored, measured, and reported on our website, you know, because we actually need the residents to come along with us. This isn't something that we're doing by ourselves for ourselves. This is something that the whole city needs to be part of. So we'll most definitely be sharing that. And I just want to say something which hasn't come up yet, which is access to finance at city level. A lot of what has been said, including the comments made by Laurent in terms of the investment that needs to be made, in our case, into new buildings. Because, you know, our building stock is at ground zero. As a city, we're now working on a housing scheme. It'll be the first time ever. So there's a unique opportunity to ensure that as we're building from scratch, we are building with the right technologies, but that requires access to finance. And that's not something that's always easy, not just in terms of it being a green space, but finance that's available at the city level. But
Great.
to end on a very positive note.
Yeah, please.
End on a positive note. What we've done in the last 2 years of me being in office has been to have the city focus on making Freetown green. And this, as I said in my earlier submission, this is something that's down to each one of us. We're on a race to zero. Everybody has to play their part.
Yeah, thank you. So we are going to have to move to the second panel for time. And we're going to bring in 3 experts to comment briefly on what they've heard. And I'm going to ask them for their initial reactions. So to start things off, we have Naomi Oreskes, the professor of the history of science at Harvard. Professor Oreskes, lots of great ideas here, but what are your initial thoughts on how this fits into the big climate challenge?
Well, this has been a great panel. It's been really nice to hear the positive things that are taking place in Freetown, in Bogota. And certainly I would like to live in Bogota if it becomes a 15-minute city. I think all of us have had the experience of what a waste of time and money and energy commuting is. So the vision of a different kind of city, I think, is one that's very, very appealing. And I think those kinds of positive visions are essential for mobilizing citizens to be on board and have buy-in into these activities. But I also agree completely with what Laurent said about so many of the initiatives that we see around the globe today are really great. They're really inspiring. And you can see how across the globe, people are working really hard to come up with creative and effective solutions for cities. But in almost all cases, it's just not enough. And the rate at which the change is happening is just not even close to what it needs to be for us to meet our climate targets. And so I think that's the huge question that's facing all of us. How do we accelerate the pace of change? How do we scale the amount of change? And how do we create a sense of urgency that this really has to happen now? And it's not enough to just say, it's really difficult. I mean, we know it is difficult, and we know that people are working really hard, and we know there are lots of obstacles. But if we don't figure out some way to get around those obstacles, we will not reach our goals. And then, as several people have already suggested, there'll be flooding. We're already seeing flooding, hurricanes, the whole litany of stuff. We don't need to rehearse it here. All of this is going to get worse. And then we're going to be in a negative feedback loop because all these changes cost money, as our mayor from Freetown said. But the more we start spending money on cleaning up climate damage, the less money we have to fix it. And then you can imagine a very depressing downward cycle, which I hope is not what happens.
I think we all hope that's not what happens. Next, we have Dr. Maria Nera, Director, Department of Environment, Climate Change and Health at the World Health Organization. Dr. Nera, thanks for joining. And if you want to share your initial reactions on the first panel.
Well, I think they are all definitely very much passionate about what they're doing, and they understand what the needs are. And I understand as well that COVID will be an extra challenge for all of them. My call will be to add to their passion and to their motivation the fact that air pollution at the moment is causing 7 million premature deaths. And in fact, after COVID, now that we need to engage in this economic recuperation as well for the countries, the citizens will accept and absorb and receive very well anything that will reduce their vulnerability to the next pandemics or the next crisis like climate change and others. So we need to give them this positive message and saying, okay, I'm taking these measures and I'm still investing on a sustainable transport, public transport system, not only because our city needs to become more environmentally friendly and zero netting and all the narrative we were giving you before, but the extra argument, and I think it can be very, very powerful, is that we are doing that as well to reduce your vulnerability, protect your lungs, protect your health, and constructing a society that will reduce the risk for being again exposed to a big pandemic or another crisis like climate change.
That's great. Finally, we have Richa Sharma, founder and CEO of Humankind. Richa, your initial thoughts?
Thanks, Brad, and it's an honor to be here. So I actually want to pick something what Mayor Akisoya said, that make it personal. And I totally agree that This is what we actually are doing about in our work at Humankind. While we are talking about all these components and sectors, everything synthesizes in your everyday life. But what is happening is that the bottom, at the very grassroots level, at the bottom, people don't know these. They don't see it as statistics. They don't see it as numbers. They see it as part of their everyday life, which unfortunately is not even happening so far. So in India, for example, 11% of global traffic related deaths happen, and about 74,000 people die due to transport emissions, right? Are we at a position today, while we want to accelerate, instead of looking at acceleration and pumping adrenaline in the way we are creating cities and going towards climate justice, are we in a position to hold back and create a projectile with people, projectile of change with people? So what we do at Humankind is we are actually tapping into this innate kindness which people have, because it's not only important to have empathy for the people who have been left behind, but it is important to actually commit to action. And that action, one of the questions was also about buy-in. That only comes when there is a equity, there's a co-design, and the whole transition happens in the process, where I would just like to show you demonstrate a difference between a paradigm. Can we go from a very technocratic approach to a humanistic approach? Or can we look at changing from capacity to developing wisdom? Or can we look at only climate science, or should we also bring contemplative science and in general human values in this whole process? So I'll stop here, and we can, this is the whole thing, that can you look at kindness as a currency of social change, of bringing, in our whole work, we have children as part of our core design process. And this is not that we just want to give them rights, but in 2050, these children would be 40-year-old youth, right? So we are looking at intergenerational action and developing a very localized approach of changing our narrative of how we are living in our cities and what kind of life we want.
Right. So I'd like to go back to Naomi's really important point about urgency. And, you know, there is a question, one of sort of technical challenges here. How fast can technology scale and institutions? And then I guess some of what Rishi was hitting at was there's this question of, can we get in the right mindset to address climate as an emergency? It seems like some of what's being talked about here is that if we focus a lot on how cities could actually be a lot better in a low carbon world, that could be a powerful motivator. But you know, Naomi, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is that enough to really get the urgency and scale that you know is pretty daunting for what we need to get to net zero by mid-century?
Yeah, this is a really tough question, and you know, I don't have the answer, but I can give you some thoughts. I think one of the tensions about climate change is that many of us have experienced personally, and we're often told that if you just tell the gloom and doom story, people shut down, they don't want to hear it, nobody likes bad news, and you just become the bearer of bad news and people don't want to listen to you. But at the same time, if you paint a positive vision of how this can actually be solved with creative, you know, innovative building practices, creative urban planning, appropriate application of innovative renewable energy technologies and energy storage, then it's easy for people to think, oh, well, it's all fine and I don't have to worry. And so how do you find that balancing act between being negative enough that people really understand that this is urgent, that it's serious, that people are getting hurt, that people are dying, that people are losing their homes and their communities to fires and floods and wild, you know, the whole litany again. And yet also at the same time say, but we can fix it. And here's what it might look like. And I think we can do that. I think this is a great panel because I think in a sense, everyone on this panel is kind of in that space. But it's really a fine line. And I've noticed, especially in the last couple of years, the invitations I have got have changed in a very, very notable way. It used to be people would just say, come and tell us about this problem. Come and tell us about the science. Come and tell us what you know. And now they say, and I'm not making this up, people have said to me, but don't be pessimistic. People have actually instructed me, and I get a little hot under the collar about that because, you know, you can't really tell me what to say if you invite me to be on your panel. But I get it. It's people are also frightened. I think a lot of people are very scared and they're worried that a message that's too negative will leave people in a place of despair that leads to inaction.
Yeah. Maria, I'd love to hear your perspective from thinking about this from a standpoint of public health. Are there lessons from public health we've learned about how to convey the urgency of certain threats? We're obviously going through a big example now. And are those applicable to climate, or is it just a completely different challenge?
I think, like Professor Naomi, our public health world is full of paradoxes as well. I mean, I've been arguing about the importance of stopping smoking because it's responsible for 8 million deaths every year. As I said before, air pollution is killing 7 million people every year. And still, for some reasons, even if we were very strict on our messages and not trying to be too idealistic or present it in a positive way, it still has never generated this sense of urgency, this sense of emergency, the sense of I need to do something about. So in public health, you have funny situations and very difficult to interpret. Is all related as well how people perceive the risk and how for them is very acute. However, a bacteria, a virus can provoke this type of reaction. And the proof is that who will in the public health world even think about the possibility of the whole planet being paralyzed, the whole economy completely on stop mode because we were threatened by a virus, definitely a dangerous virus, but taking the measures that were unprecedented. And nobody was questioning the fact that the economy will suffer. So the society decided to do all of that in the name of health. So there are lessons, certainly there are lessons. And one of the lessons now is that, of course, we don't want to go back now after the pandemic and telling the society, listen, that was nothing compared with what is coming up now with climate change. That will be even worse. Certainly we can't do that. I mean, human nature cannot absorb all of those terrible amount of bad news. But now we need to keep the sense of emergency on the better preparation for future crisis, a pandemic or a climate change or the future of a very polluted city. And then making sure that the stimulus packages that the governments are now dedicating for the economic recovery after COVID-19 are going into the right direction. So the sense of urgency and emergency needs to go through politicians these times. And I'm afraid, dear mayors, this sense of urgency has to go through you as well. You are somehow, you have on your hands, for good or for bad, a lot of public health responsibility. So I'm sure that if you have an opportunity to do some financial investment now in your city to recover the economy, make sure you do it in a sustainable way. Don't go back to cities where traffic is, again, as the mayor of Bogota was saying, our cities are fantastic for cars. But may I remind you that there is something called human beings, citizens that live on the city. So I refuse to think that there is nothing that can be done for those human beings that live in the city, that they will have the right to breathe clean air. And so I think the argument now to maintain this sense of emergency is we need to reduce your vulnerability. You have been very vulnerable, your lungs have been very vulnerable, your health in general. So how can we make sure that we take measures to reduce this risk? And we will do it by investing on green, renewable energy, on sustainable public transport systems, on making our cities more friendly and people able to walk and use a bicycle and having social interaction. I think our citizens are as well very much in demand now for having social connection again, and a good one that where you don't feel totally threatened. So the urgency will be maintained by using the health argument, but on a very, very pragmatic and proactive way. We need to move on actions. So maybe, dear mayors, and sorry to put you a big responsibility again on your hands, but this is about cities, netting zero cities. You are ministers of health, but the strategic ones now in charge of leading this post-COVID recovery. So in your next campaign, normally in your campaign, you always have a slogan, the mayor that will bring Bogota to the international, I don't know what was your campaign, but this time maybe your campaign slogan has to be the mayor that will save your lungs, the mayor that will reduce asthma cases, the mayor that will reduce. So maybe if we use all of those health arguments, we can maintain the emergency while we do not terrify the population that is terrified enough by now. Over.
Richa, I'd like to hear your response to that. Are there things that mayors and cities should be thinking about that maybe even they're not thinking about now as they sort of set these priorities and figure out how to motivate people to accelerate action on climate change?
So first of all, I totally agree with what Dr. Neira has just said. But all the more important, when both the mayors were talking about people and civic engagement, the whole idea is that how do you actually, at the very basic level, involve them, not participation, but how do you make them actual co-design, how do you make them actually co-designers of the whole process? And this is what we've been doing here in New Delhi. We've been looking at, for example, 45 children die every day, right? In India due to road accidents. But not a single parent knows about this statistic. And they look at it as a problem which is related to cars, but it is actually a public health issue because everything is interrelated. So when we go to parents and we are talking about this, that is the time they start questioning their decision makers. That is the time they start questioning the institutional systems that we are operating in. So my inference to all of this is that cities are birthing stories every day. And if we are distorting and disrupting stories because of injustices and inequities, and we are just building on that, it's time to disrupt that and create those stories which mean well-being. Because looking at Indian cities, more than 60% of carbon emissions that due to transport can be reduced if people shift to active transport, because all of this happens within a 6-kilometer radii. And in all of this, if you look at, if children, they don't use any transport, they don't have a say in all of this. What if we actually show them an example of how they can be co-designers at a very early stage? How can you bring equity, social justice, and climate justice from the very beginning? How can you reduce the gap between a child and a decision maker? And how do you then make citizens and adults which will be actually paving the right? They will be mayors, they will be technocrats later. How do you actually disrupt that way of building capacities by leveraging wisdom and leveraging values? So this is my suggestion to both mayors on the panel, because they really, I agree with Dr. Neira, they're truly passionate about the change they are wanting to see in their city. But it's also, how do you build that momentum and bring leaders, young leaders, civic leaders, leaders and parents, and bring authenticity in the way urbanization should happen.
Great. Naomi, is there something you'd like to add on the motivation question? I think you're still muted.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, I'd like to return to Dr. Neira's point, because she raised something really important and close to my heart, which is the issue of tobacco deaths. And as Dr. Neira pointed out, 8 million people die every year in the world from tobacco-caused illnesses, totally preventable illnesses. So that's more than die from air pollution. And why is that? Well, a significant part of that is the continued advertising and marketing of tobacco products by industry around the globe, industry that has engaged in incredibly unscrupulous practices in many developing nations to prevent public health initiatives and to undermine public health. So if we look at the question, how did we reduce tobacco deaths in the United States? One of the things we know is it was by controlling tobacco advertising and marketing. And how did we motivate that? Well, we motivated with a lot of anger when people began to understand what the tobacco industry was really up to. Now, I found anger is a delicate subject. People don't like anger, it's upsetting. It's not our favorite emotion. Kindness, generosity, compassion are much better, but sometimes anger is appropriate. And when it's properly channeled, it can be powerful. And I think as a historian, one of the things I sometimes think about is what has driven social change in the past. And I think we often see that anger and outrage at injustice, anger at bad practices. These are very, very powerful motivators. And so I think one of the things we need to talk about, and that I found that often people are reluctant to talk about, but it's really important, is the practices of the fossil fuel industry. And I think that we should be angry at those industries. And I think we need to find ways to channel that anger to motivate people to say, yes, this is hurting you. This is killing people. As Dr. Nera said, 7 million people dying just from air pollution alone, let alone the wildfires and everything else. We should be angry about this, and we should start to demand changes to how the fossil fuel industry is allowed to act in our country. So this isn't something that cities by themselves have a lot of control over, but cities are very, very powerful places, have a lot of political power. And I think that it's something that should be on our docket, should be something that we should be thinking about.
Okay, Maria, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, because I think Naomi touched on something absolutely fundamental, which is getting impatient or getting irritated or getting, upset. And I think that the health professionals, the health community, honestly, we are getting very upset and very impatient. I mean, the fact that burning fossil is killing us, and we are still there, and we are still paying subsidies to fossil fuels. We are destinating around 400 billion every year collectively from our taxpayers to subsidize fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are contributing to climate change, are contributing to air pollution, which is responsible for 7 million deaths. So it's killing us. And we all know that this is anyway something that has to change. It's just a question of time. So here my call is, if it's a question of time, let's be very ambitious. Let's be regarding the speed for reaching that day when we will be totally decarbonized as a society, and stopping to kill our people. We destinate money to, we use money to pay fossil fuels subsidies without incorporating into that equation the fact that we spend much more money to then treat the negative health consequences of breathing that polluted air or the consequences of burning fossil fuels. So yes, stop paying subsidies. We are getting impatient as a health community. The pediatricians, the clinicians, the doctors working at hospitals, they don't want anymore to keep treating patients on a very nice and polite and professional way. They are starting to get out of the hospitals and saying, there is no point of me treating a patient if I send him back to a very polluted environment, a very polluted city where this person will be sick again. So we need to change our cities, and we need to make sure that people understand that if they are exposed to air pollution, if they are exposed to fossil fuels, there will be at risk. For us, fossil fuels are the new tobacco. Allow me to use this expression in quote unquote, because we are making a big campaign, and maybe one day we will be able to put on the petrol stations a tag, fossil fuels kills, as we do for the tobacco. So that will be my dream, hopefully coming true in a reality very soon.
So I'd like to bring the first panel back to respond to this, because I'd particularly be interested, both Mayor Lopez and Mayor Aki Sawyer talk a little bit about what they have found are good ways to motivate people in cities to take the steps needed to reduce emissions. We've talked a lot about fiscal incentives here and public investments and money, but in the second panel, we talked a lot about other sort of non-financial incentives, and this was a question of redress. So, both maybe start with you, Mayor Aki Sawyer. What have you found that resonates with people to try to take action? You're still muted, I think.
One of the things that Professor Naomi said was about the invitations that she got, where people would say to her, don't make everybody feel bad, keep it light, keep it light. And I think that that's where our responsibility comes as cities. People don't want to feel helpless. They don't want you to present them with a problem and then they don't know where to go with that problem. So our job is to try and create an enabling environment, whether it's the 30-minute city that the mayor of Bogota has been talking about, or the planning which we are also seeking to do, whether it's improving transport links, whether it's planting trees, it's giving people, or whether it's community engagement around flood mitigation activities, something else that we have to do to mitigate the already existing challenge of climate change impact. But I think our job is to create the enabling environment. Now, is it a job that we can do without challenge? I mean, I listened to Dr. Neira talking about, fossil fuels, the new tobacco, we're gonna fight against it. But at the same time, one of you mentioned the fact that when the big tobacco companies were shut out of the West, where did they go? They went to the developing countries where the regulations are much weaker, where they can use tactics which enable them to sell their products many times even underage to underage users and grow those dependencies. So I want to come back to this point that I make, that if we're going to succeed with this fight, then we all need to have all hands on deck and not to imagine that the solutions in one part of the world are going to be the solutions in the other part of the world, but be prepared to help and work together. C40 is a great platform. We are mayors from all over the world, but we're working on common objectives and we're investing. We're actually not, this is not lip service. We're investing in capacity. We're investing in technology. We're actually sharing information so that collectively we can strengthen our cities. We have a moral obligation, a political obligation to create the enabling environment. But where we have weaknesses, we need the pressure that you're talking about from the West. We need that anger that you talked about, that we're not having this anymore. But we need it not just to be in New York and in Geneva, but we need it to really attack those who are the polluters and to help those of us who have less bargaining power in other parts of the world to make sure that the solutions you have in the West are not just pushing the problem to another part of the world. Because we've seen with COVID that what we face now as a global community is not restricted to one part of the globe. If it happens to me, it's gonna happen to you.
Great. Mayor Lopez, anything to add on that? That was a great answer, but I'm sure you have your perspective. You're muted still. Mayor Lopez, you're still muted.
Well, it has been such a great conversation on points that it's hard to add something meaningful. But let me just say that I think, even though, as our mayor for Freetown says, how to do things are local decisions. It's very different how to make a greenable, equable, sustainable city in Freetown rather than in Bogota or in India. So solutions are local, but conversation has to be global because the challenges are the same. Because those who we have to fight to make this new, green, sustainable social contract of the 21st century are global actors. They are not necessarily local actors. So this has to be a global conversation, a global movement, in particular of cities. If you see the history of the last 200 years, every time a new pandemic comes around, there's always people saying, oh, this is gonna be the death of cities. When cholera came, it's gonna be the death of cities. When COVID comes, then it's gonna be the death of cities. Cities are not gonna die. 80% of the people live in cities. What we need is greenable, sustainable, better, equable cities. And they can be planned, they can be done, we can invest, but we need to build majorities for that city. We need to give voice to the youth and women who are the leaders of this new social contract of the 21st century. After every war and after every pandemic, humanity needs to come to a new social contract. That's the global conversation that we need to do. What are the fiscal incentives we're gonna put? What are the fiscal income that we're gonna generate, right? How are we gonna generate it? How is it possible that in the 21st century, as Professor Maria Nera is saying, our governments are still daring to subsidize fools In the 21st century, in the middle of climate change, come on. In 2020, we have global majorities to push this agenda forward. And that's what we need to do, in particular, in uniting the conversation of cities, which are 80% of the population of the world, in being more influential, in getting direct finance and direct sources to build this new green, sustainable social contract of the 21st century.
So this has been great. I just want to mention there have been so many great audience questions. And I really want to thank Laurent, who has been going through and answering so many of them in the Q&A chat, especially because many of them were really smart about buildings. And thank you so much, Laurent. We have to move on to the final segment of our conversation. We're going to bring back Gonzalo Muñoz. And Gonzalo, you set out the challenge at the beginning of this event. I wonder if you can comment on everything you've heard and your reaction to it.
Well, thank you, Brad, and thank you to all the panelists. I'm leaving the really inspired and a lot of clarity on the challenges that we're facing. Let me read first. My brother, he's a public transport university professor, and we were talking about this a few weeks ago, and he was saying me, one of the elements that was highlighted here was telling the COVID is showing us that we might need to move less. Then we might need to lose shorter distances. Then we might need to or be able to move in a way that we use less energy by person, by kilometer. And at the end, we might be using energy that emits less CO2. I love how much of that was referred here, not only in the idea of the utopian or idealistic 15-minute walk city of Major Hidalgo, the reality that all of you showed in that aspect, I think it was really fundamental because all of you brought ideas and solutions that we've had for maybe decades. It's not inventing the wheel. It's not using whatever type of new science. When we express the idea of first transporting in a much smarter way, as Major López was also referring to the idea of positioning cycling and pedestrian lanes as something that also is really important in this as a learning from the COVID time. No more space for cars is something that of course resonates a lot with the things that we were expressing at the end. But also what Major Akisoye brought, and then was well strengthened also by Rachi, put the people in the center. Really focus on creating green jobs as an opportunity coming out from COVID. I think there's something there, like if we think about positioning the citizen in the center, then it might also allow us to understand things that Laurent brought, and then also Naomi referred to, and Maria as well. Retrofitting in building is the smartest and fastest and the first solution for creating green, fast jobs that will also not only help to reduce the global climate crisis, but mostly reduce local contaminations that are creating respiratory diseases that like the ones that we're suffering nowadays. So it's about healthier cities for healthier citizens, and at the end for the healthier environment that we all require. And that, of course, taking me through this conversation around the curious, let's say, fossil fuel subsidy that we are confronting these days, and how much of that was very well mentioned in terms of the analogy with smoking, brings me also to this concept that Major López also brought around the locality, right? Cities have the potential on taking global challenges and implement them locally. And in that sense, of course, we have to take anger and outrage and also hope, as Naomi was referring to, in terms of develop the right narrative. But let me close by taking one of the phrases that Major Okishori also said, and I thought it was fantastic. It's about that in this race to zero, everyone has to play its part. And I'm sure you're all taking your best version of yourselves in order to really win this race to zero that we have to win all together. Thank you so much. Please count on me on helping you to develop all of your solutions, because we need you all.
Well, thank you so much, Gonzalo. And thank you everyone for joining today. This was a really fascinating exchange. We easily could have talked all day. I think, you know, it's not a secret that climate change and getting to net zero is just going to be an enormous challenge for cities to tackle. But it's also clear that there's an enormous amount of hard thinking and creativity around this problem. What we now need is basically every single city in the world to learn some of these lessons, to figure out what their own solutions are, and take steps and figure out how to motivate people in ways that may be different from city to city. So it's a huge task, but I think we've given people lots to think about on the road through that journey. So I really thank you all for joining us today. This has been an amazing panel, and thank you to the audience for all your really, really thoughtful questions. And now I will turn it over to Whitney to announce the next Netting Zero event.
Thank you, Brad, for that skillful moderation and summary. And thank you also to all of our speakers, to our audience for their participation and for your questions. We look forward to welcoming each of you to our next digital event in the Netting Zero series, focused on scalable solutions for food systems. And that event will be on October 8th. You can find more information and register for that event and others in the series at nytclimatehub.com, where a recording of today's event will also be hosted and viewable in the coming days. Thank you again to our sponsor, Con Ed, for making this event today possible. And you can also find more digital events from the New York Times on timesevents.nytimes.com. Thank you and have a good day.